The candlelight flickered across the polished oak floors of the Davenport estate, reflecting off the crystal goblets and silver candelabras as the family gathered for their evening meal. The scent of roasted meats and spiced wine filled the air, masking a tension that went unnoticed by all except one. Livia, the quiet house slave, moved with measured grace between kitchen and dining hall, her hands folded over her apron, eyes watching every gesture, every twitch of the mistress she served. To the Davenports, Livia was nothing more than obedient and unremarkable, a quiet presence who had served the household for decades without complaint. Yet beneath her serene exterior simmered a mind, sharp, patient, and deliberate, a mind that had waited 20 long years for the perfect moment to reclaim justice. This is the story of how one enslaved woman, with patience, cunning, and unwavering resolve, orchestrated a reckoning that would be remembered for generations. Before we enter the dark corridors of the Davenport estate, where are you watching from tonight? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment, and if stories like this grip you, hit subscribe, because the events you are about to witness had been concealed in the shadows of history for more than 2 decades. Livia had arrived at the Davenport estate as a young girl, her small frame easily overlooked among the bustling household. Her initial years were marked by obedience, compliance, and an acute awareness of the household's hierarchy. Mistress Davenport, the matriarch of the estate, exercised her authority through a combination of psychological torment, arbitrary punishment, and relentless surveillance. Livia learned quickly that visibility could be dangerous. Mistakes, no matter how small, could result in lashes, deprivation, or public humiliation. She cultivated the habit of quiet observation, of blending into the background while absorbing every detail of the household, every weakness, every routine, every opportunity. The mistress was capricious, delighting in controlling those around her. She measured loyalty and obedience with meticulous scrutiny, and any sign of independence was met with reprimand. Yet Livia had discovered early on that the most effective power lay not in confrontation but in observation, patience, and understanding the vulnerabilities of the oppressor. Every glance, every gesture, every word spoken in jest or anger was memorized and stored in the quiet recesses of her mind, forming a map of human behavior and the subtle levers of influence. Daily life on the Davenport estate was structured but oppressive. Livia's duties ranged from preparing meals and serving the family table to cleaning, tending to the mistress's wardrobe, and supervising younger enslaved children. She performed these tasks with precision, projecting a demeanor of obedience and subservience, while quietly noting patterns that would later prove critical. The mistress had her favorites and her scorned, and Livia studied the dynamics closely, observing who wielded influence and who faltered under scrutiny. Her learning extended beyond household mechanics to the psychology of those in power. Other enslaved people began to recognize Livia's quiet intelligence. They saw in her an unusual calm, a deliberate attentiveness that suggested a deeper understanding of both human nature and the workings of the estate. Some offered subtle assistance, a shared glance to convey awareness, a minor diversion to aid a task, or an unspoken compliance that reinforced Livia's growing influence. Yet she remained cautious, careful not to reveal her awareness or intent. Even those closest to her did not fully comprehend the breadth of her patience or the depth of her planning. Mistress Davenport's cruelty was not merely physical, it was psychological. Livia endured verbal assaults, public shaming, and the constant threat of arbitrary punishment. Each act of oppression was catalogued, stored, and studied. Livia understood that true power was not seized in moments of anger, but cultivated through years of observation, endurance, and strategic patience. The mistress believed herself untouchable, her authority absolute. Livia's compliance was the mask that would hide the wheels of her long-term plan. As the household prepared for the evening meal, Livia moved fluidly between the kitchen and dining room, carrying trays and setting the table. Every motion was deliberate, every smile calculated. She noted the habits of the mistress, her mannerisms, her preferences, her vulnerabilities. Even the simplest gestures, the way she poured wine or reached for a slice of bread, were catalogued for future use. Livia's patience had transformed routine observation into an invisible arsenal, a quiet accumulation of knowledge that would one day empower her to act decisively. The other enslaved workers maintained their roles, outwardly performing tasks while silently acknowledging Livia's presence and influence. They had learned, over time, that she was not merely a servant but a strategist whose intelligence and patience commanded subtle authority. Their complicity was quiet yet essential. No one intervened, no one betrayed, and no one challenged her movements. Together, they formed a silent network, amplifying the eventual impact of her carefully constructed plan. By nightfall, the Davenport estate hummed with the familiar rhythms of obedience and routine. Yet, beneath the surface, a patient reckoning was growing, fueled by 20 years of observation, endurance, and deliberate planning. Livia retired to her quarters with the quiet satisfaction of a mind at work, knowing that each detail she had memorized, each subtle act of compliance, and each observed weakness would soon converge into a moment of inevitable justice. The mistress believed herself secure, the household believed in the continuity of authority, and the other enslaved workers played their silent parts. All were unaware that a storm of calculated vengeance was gathering quietly in the shadows, ready to strike at the precise moment when patience, intelligence, and courage aligned. The winter of 1812 had settled over the Davenport estate, and the air was sharp with cold that penetrated the thin walls of the slave quarters and the opulent halls of the main house alike. Livia had grown taller, stronger, and more composed in her years of servitude, but outwardly she remained quiet and seemingly compliant, a house slave whose intelligence was underestimated by all who relied upon her. Mistress Davenport continued to impose her petty cruelties, oblivious to the subtle strength Livia was cultivating. Every insult, every belittling order, every public punishment was noted and stored away like grain in a silo, reserved for the day when her patience would yield the long-awaited reckoning. Livia's early acts of defiance were invisible to the casual observer. She misarranged silverware ever so slightly, delayed the serving of certain dishes, and intentionally allowed minor oversights in the household to occur without drawing attention to herself. These small acts were lessons in observation and control, testing the limits of the mistress's vigilance while refining Livia's understanding of how fear, authority, and obedience interplayed. Even the slightest hesitation by the overseers or the mistress was catalogued, providing a blueprint for the orchestration that would one day unfold with precision. The house was a labyrinth of opportunity, and Livia explored it with careful attention. She memorized hidden closets, seldom used stairwells, the weak locks on doors, and the blind spots in the mistress's surveillance. Each corner of the Davenport estate, from the wine cellar to the servants' hall, became a mental map of potential leverage and escape routes. Over years, this knowledge became as instinctual as breathing. Livia understood the rhythm of the household, the timing of meals, the patterns of inspections, and the specific moments when the mistress's attention waned. Allies among the enslaved workers emerged, though discreetly. Some were older housemaids who had endured decades of cruelty and understood the value of discretion. Some were field hands, quiet observers of household dynamics. Livia did not recruit openly, but through subtle glances, slight gestures, and shared understanding, she created a network of silent support. These allies reinforced her authority without alerting the mistress. Their complicity was unspoken but essential. Each person's awareness increased the inevitability of the eventual act of justice. The mistress remained unaware of the patient storm gathering within her own house. She continued to indulge her caprices, often punishing small infractions and reveling in the obedience of the enslaved. Her arrogance was complete, her belief in her untouchable authority absolute. Yet Livia's keen observation revealed cracks in her mistress's demeanor. A slight hesitation in issuing orders, a predictable reliance on certain tools and routines, a pattern in how she moved through the house. These seemingly trivial details were the building blocks of a meticulous plan that would take 20 years to perfect. As seasons passed, Livia developed a rhythm of patience that became both discipline and weapon. She allowed years to accrue, observing, testing boundaries, and collecting the subtle implements that would one day facilitate her revenge. Each day of servitude, each indignity endured, and each injustice witnessed was folded into her strategy. Nothing was left to chance. The act of vengeance she envisioned required absolute precision, timing, method, and psychological mastery. Impulsiveness could ruin everything, and Livia understood this better than anyone. While performing her daily duties, preparing meals, cleaning, tending to the mistress's wardrobe, Livia also studied the human behaviors surrounding her. She noted how the mistress reacted to stress, how her commands faltered when distracted, and which overseers could be influenced subtly. The smallest gestures, an overlooked step, a misdelivered message, or a distracted glance became lessons in manipulation, providing a silent rehearsal for the night when her patience would culminate in decisive action. Even the youngest members of the household were observed carefully. Children played under the mistress's gaze, unaware that their behavior would teach Livia about patterns, timing, and psychological leverage. Every laugh, cry, and interaction became a data point. Over years, these observations coalesced into an understanding of the household as a living, breathing organism, one that could be manipulated and eventually overturned without detection. By the time Livia retired to her quarters each night, she had already rehearsed in her mind the methods she would employ, the routes she would take, and the timing required for perfect execution. She did not dwell on anger or revenge impulsively. Instead, she catalogued, analyzed, and patiently planned. 20 years of suffering had been transformed into a repository of knowledge and strategy. Each act of cruelty she endured, each insult she observed, was folded into the architecture of inevitability. The night air, cold and crisp outside the windows, carried the distant sound of horses and the faint murmur of wind through the plantation's pines. Inside, the household slept in apparent peace, unaware that a quiet force was gathering within its walls. Livia's patience was her power, her intelligence was her weapon, and her slow, deliberate cultivation of opportunity ensured that when the moment of reckoning arrived, it would be precise, unstoppable, and terrifyingly inevitable. The seeds of vengeance had been sown, watered by decades of careful observation and meticulous planning. The harvest was still years away, but the foundation had been laid, and the inevitability of justice was growing quietly, like a storm gathering on the horizon. The years passed like the slow turning of the seasons, each one bringing Livia closer to the culmination of her long-conceived plan. The Davenport estate seemed unchanged to outsiders. The polished floors still gleamed, the silverware arranged precisely, and the mistress continued her rounds of petty cruelties with absolute confidence in her authority. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, Livia had begun collecting both the means and knowledge necessary to execute her long-awaited revenge. Every object in the house, every hidden corner, every overlooked passage became a potential instrument of power, and she catalogued them meticulously in her mind, storing away years of observation like a carefully curated library. Her methods were subtle and precise. Over decades, she learned which candlesticks were heavy enough to serve as levers, which cellar doors were weak enough to be forced open silently, and which floorboards concealed the smallest spaces where items could be hidden or messages exchanged. She observed the master's routines in painstaking detail, which rooms were unguarded at certain times, how the servants moved throughout the house, the sequence in which meals were prepared and served, and how the mistress's moods influenced her movements. Each observation, each minute detail, added another layer to the meticulous architecture of her plan. Poison, the most delicate instrument of her vengeance, required patience and study. Livia experimented quietly, sometimes using herbs and ingredients that mimicked effects without attracting suspicion. She learned the subtle differences between bitter and sweet, the way certain spices could mask or enhance a flavor, and the precise timing necessary to ensure effectiveness without detection. These small, clandestine experiments were hidden in the shadows of the pantry and the cellar, unnoticed by the master and overseers who believed her attentiveness was nothing more than diligent service. Meanwhile, she cultivated a network of silent allies among the enslaved workers. Trusted housemaids, older cooks, and discreet field hands were drawn into the folds of her planning, their understanding implicit rather than spoken. They learned to move without drawing attention, to execute subtle diversions, and to maintain an unbroken facade of compliance. Their loyalty was earned over years of observation and quiet influence, creating a web of human complicity that would magnify the power of her eventual act. Theirs was a shared understanding. Patience, observation, and silence were their greatest weapons. Even the mundane objects of daily life became essential components of her strategy. A spoon placed just so could conceal the smallest instrument. A key mislaid temporarily could create confusion at a critical moment. A candle's position on the dining table could ensure shadows masked her true movements. Livia had developed a mental map of every implement and object in the house, integrating them into a framework for the night that would finally bring justice. She understood the poetry of subtlety. What appeared ordinary could become lethal in the hands of someone patient, intelligent, and deliberate. The mistress remained oblivious. Davenport's arrogance and cruelty had blinded her to the quiet accumulation of knowledge around her. She continued to belittle, threaten, and control, believing her authority absolute, never suspecting that the very tools she wielded for dominance would one day be turned against her. Livia's patience was her shield, her intelligence, the invisible blade. Each year of servitude, each humiliation endured, each injustice catalogued, was folded into the plan with the precision of a master strategist. Over time, Livia even studied human reactions to fear, surprise, and duress. She noted how the mistress responded when confronted with unexpected sounds, minor misplacements, or subtle disruptions in routine. Each observation informed the timing and structure of her final act, ensuring that the plan would unfold exactly as intended. The combination of years of patient study, subtle sabotage, and careful collection of tools created a framework so precise that the mistress would be caught entirely unprepared. By the turn of the decade, Livia had become invisible in plain sight. Her demeanor, obedient and unremarkable, allowed her to move freely within the household while her mind catalogued every possibility, every contingency. She rehearsed her moves mentally, envisioning each step, each sound, and each reaction of the mistress and the enslaved workers who would participate in subtle ways. The plan was no longer just an idea, it was a living, breathing architecture of patience and intelligence. Livia's quiet years had transformed her into a master of observation, a collector of tools, and a strategist whose patient mind had turned 20 years of oppression into a carefully constructed pathway toward vengeance. Every hidden corner, every overlooked implement, every silent ally contributed to a network of power that would remain invisible until the precise moment of execution. The final act was approaching, and the world of the Davenport estate, confident in its apparent order, remained oblivious to the storm that had been quietly gathering beneath its polished surface. As she moved through the quiet halls at night, checking locks, counting implements, and mentally rehearsing sequences, Livia felt a sense of inevitability. Years of patient observation and meticulous preparation had converged into a plan so precise, so inevitable, that the moment of execution would be flawless. Each second of restraint, each act of obedience, and each subtle maneuver had led to this point. The tools were in place, the allies were ready, and the final act of long-delayed justice was poised to unfold, silent, calculated, and unstoppable. By the late 1820 seconds, Livia had transformed from a quiet, obedient house slave into a figure whose presence, though unassuming, carried a quiet authority among the enslaved workers. Her patience, intelligence, and meticulous planning had reached a point where she could manipulate events within the Davenport estate without ever revealing her intent. She moved through the halls with the same measured grace that had earned the mistress's trust, observing the subtleties of her household while quietly orchestrating the preliminary maneuvers that would ensure her ultimate revenge. Each action was calculated, each gesture deliberate, designed to create patterns of disruption that seemed coincidental but were meticulously engineered. The mistress, Davenport, remained blissfully unaware of the quiet influence building around her. Her cruelty and capriciousness continued unabated, but she was blind to the subtle shifts occurring within her household. Livia had learned to use ordinary objects as instruments of her strategy, A candlestick could be shifted to block a corridor momentarily. A misplaced key could delay access to a room. A table set slightly askew could influence the mistress's movements in predictable ways. These manipulations were invisible to outsiders, unnoticed by the overseers, and yet they slowly tightened Livia's control over the dynamics of the estate. Livia also began testing the reactions of the other enslaved workers, gauging loyalty and awareness. She used subtle glances, gestures, and coded movements to communicate instructions without arousing suspicion. A hand brushing a tray just slightly, a whisper that only a trusted ally could interpret, a pause in motion timed perfectly, all became part of a silent language that allowed her to coordinate minor disruptions and maintain her strategic advantage. Each ally understood the stakes. Obedience to the plan was survival, and silence was power. The subtlety of Livia's actions extended to her psychological manipulation of the mistress. Davenport's overconfidence made her predictable. She assumed that her authority was absolute, and that Livia, her quiet servant, posed no threat. This assumption allowed Livia to place small traps and distractions that would later play crucial roles in her ultimate act of revenge. A misplaced candle in the hallway could direct the mistress's steps precisely. A jar of herbs slightly shifted on a shelf could delay a routine task, all building toward the perfect convergence of events for the night of reckoning. Even the timing of meals, chores, and social gatherings was exploited. Livia observed the precise order in which the mistress conducted her evenings. When she preferred to dine, when she inspected the house, when the overseers conducted their rounds. By aligning her subtle interventions with these routines, she could control the flow of the household without ever drawing attention to herself. Every adjustment was deliberate, every interference calculated to create a rhythm that would favor her ultimate plan. The enslaved workers began to recognize patterns in Livia's behavior and adapted accordingly. Minor delays, misplacements, and interventions became accepted as part of the household's invisible pulse. Yet no one outside the network could perceive the orchestrated nature of these actions. To the mistress, everything appeared ordinary. To Livia, every movement was a rehearsal, every reaction a note in a symphony of eventual justice. Psychologically, Livia wielded influence that was invisible but undeniable. The overseers, unaware of her subtle manipulations, began to sense inconsistencies and minor disturbances. Horses were occasionally guided slightly off course, doors seemed to swing open at odd moments, and tasks were delayed with no clear explanation. These small anomalies fostered unease, a creeping uncertainty that Livia had engineered without ever exposing herself to risk. Fear was growing quietly, an undercurrent that would make the final act of vengeance more devastating and effective. By the 1,830 seconds, Livia's subtle manipulations had fully embedded themselves in the household routine. The mistress's arrogance remained intact, but the estate itself had been transformed into a stage for Livia's patient orchestration. She continued her duties with practiced compliance, but every act carried the weight of long-term strategy. Minor disruptions, calculated delays, and silent coordination with allies were all part of the framework she had built over decades. The patience and intelligence that had characterized Livia's early years of observation had now matured into mastery of the household. She had created a lattice of influence, subtle but powerful, through which she could direct outcomes without ever raising suspicion. The tools, allies, and understanding of human behavior she had cultivated were ready to converge, ensuring that the moment of execution would unfold with inevitability, precision, and the perfect balance of horror and justice. As Livia prepared the household for the evening, adjusting trays, lighting candles, and observing the mistress's predictable movements, the sense of inevitability grew stronger. The quiet, methodical manipulations had prepared the environment for the final act. The stage was set, the actors unaware, and the instruments of control were poised for the moment when Livia's patience and intelligence would culminate in a reckoning 20 years in the making. The household moved with a false sense of security, oblivious to the patient storm gathering within its walls. The air was thick with humidity and the scent of roasted meats as the Davenport estate prepared for the evening gathering that would mark the culmination of Livia's 20 years of patient observation and careful orchestration. The candles flickered across the polished oak floors, casting long shadows that danced across the walls, giving the room a deceptive sense of warmth and elegance. To the Davenports, it was another ordinary evening, another night in which the mistress could assert her authority and indulge in the caprices that had defined her household. To Livia, it was the night her careful patience, intelligence, and precise planning would finally converge into action, a reckoning 20 years in the making. For decades, Livia had moved invisibly through the estate. She had memorized every corner, every hidden passage, every routine. Every servant, overseer, and family member had been catalogued in her mind, their patterns noted, their weaknesses logged. Every object in the house, from candlesticks to cellar doors, from loose floorboards to the heavy iron keys, was part of a framework she had quietly constructed. The years of observation and subtle sabotage had laid the foundation for a night where control, fear, and inevitability would be hers alone. The household moved through its usual rituals. Dinner was served with practiced precision. Servants carried trays while guests adjusted chairs and polished silverware. The mistress, confident in her absolute authority, made no effort to conceal her arrogance. She believed herself untouchable, unaware that the very instruments she relied upon for power, timing, routine, and obedience had been mapped and manipulated by the quiet house slave she had long dismissed as compliant and harmless. Livia coordinated every step, silently communicating with trusted allies through glances, gestures, and the small, seemingly accidental movements that had become her invisible language. One servant nudged a tray slightly off course. Another delayed the lighting of a candle just enough to create a shadow across the hallway. These minor manipulations were invisible to the mistress, but essential in controlling the environment and ensuring the inevitability of the night's outcome. The other enslaved workers remained poised, aware that their silence and subtle assistance were critical. They were participants in the execution of a plan that balanced patience, intelligence, and precise timing. The night's preparations had been meticulous. Poison was carefully concealed among the meals, ingredients subtly altered, and every placement calculated to ensure maximum effectiveness without immediate detection. Livia's years of study had allowed her to predict how the mistress would behave, how the household staff would react, and even how the guests would respond to minor delays or misdirections. Every detail, from the arrangement of silverware to the placement of chairs, had been rehearsed in her mind countless times. As dinner progressed, Livia observed the effects of her preparations. The mistress moved through the room with practiced authority, yet subtle tremors betrayed a growing unease. Minor symptoms began to appear in those who had partaken of the carefully prepared food, a testament to the precision of her measurements. The other servants moved with deliberate calm, maintaining the appearance of normalcy while ensuring that every minor act aligned with Livia's larger strategy. The illusion of order concealed the inevitability that had been building for decades. In the quiet corners, Livia's patience revealed its power. She waited for the exact moments when reactions would ripple through the household most effectively, ensuring that the psychological impact was as devastating as the physical consequences. Every gesture, every movement, every minor disruption had been calculated to reinforce her authority and sow confusion among the overseers and family alike. Her intelligence transformed ordinary objects and routine behaviors into instruments of control, amplifying the effect of her long-conceived plan. By the end of the meal, the effects were undeniable. The mistress's confidence faltered, her commands became hesitant, and the orchestrated disturbances escalated into visible disorder. Chairs scraped across the floor, trays were dropped or delayed, and whispers of unease spread among the family and overseers. Samuel's patient plan had matured, demonstrating that the quiet, seemingly compliant house slave wielded an authority born of intelligence, observation, and meticulous preparation rather than brute force. Livia's patient orchestration reached its apex as she guided the mistress toward the hidden cellar that had been carefully prepared years earlier. Every step, every subtle redirection, ensured that the mistress remained unaware of the inevitability approaching. Other enslaved workers, trained in silence and subtle compliance, moved imperceptibly to maintain the illusion of order while assisting in the final moments. The culmination of 20 years of observation, patience, and calculated subtlety was imminent. When the moment arrived, it was executed with a precision that left no room for error. The mistress, trapped in the prepared space, could not escape. The careful manipulations of routine, observation, and environment ensured that every contingency had been accounted for. Livia's intelligence, patience, and long-term strategy had transformed her from a seemingly harmless house slave into the orchestrator of inevitable justice. The household, once confident in its hierarchy and control, had become a stage for the ultimate demonstration of the quiet, deliberate, and unstoppable power of patience harnessed over decades. By the early hours of the morning, the night had concluded. The mistress was buried alive, an end meticulously planned and executed with unwavering precision. The other enslaved workers remained silent witnesses, their complicity reinforcing the inevitability and justice of the act. Livia had transformed decades of suffering into a calculated reckoning, demonstrating that patience, intelligence, and subtlety could surpass cruelty, arrogance, and brute authority. The Davenport estate, once a symbol of unquestioned power, had been irrevocably altered. The first light of dawn filtered through the windows of the Davenport estate, painting the polished floors with a pale, cold glow. Silence hung in the air, heavy and deliberate, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The household, once ruled by Mistress Davenport's tyranny, was now in a state of frozen disbelief. The carefully maintained illusion of authority had been shattered in a single, meticulously orchestrated act of vengeance. Livia, the house slave who had endured 2 decades of cruelty, had transformed patience, intelligence, and observation into instruments of justice, leaving a legacy that would reverberate long after the echoes of her actions faded from immediate memory. The enslaved workers moved quietly through the estate, performing their routines with a careful balance of normalcy and silent awareness. They understood the magnitude of what had occurred and the subtle power it conferred. For years, they had observed Livia's intelligence and patient manipulations. Now they were witnesses to the culmination of her long-conceived plan. Their collective silence and measured actions had amplified the inevitability of the night's outcome. Every glance, every nod, every imperceptible gesture had been part of a silent covenant, a shared understanding that justice, when patiently calculated, could reshape the very hierarchy of power. The immediate impact on the Davenport family was profound. News of the mistress's disappearance and subsequent discovery circulated with whispers and speculation, shaking the local community. Rumors of her demise, shrouded in uncertainty, fostered fear among neighbors and distant plantation owners alike. Livia had ensured that the act appeared isolated, carefully orchestrating evidence to prevent immediate suspicion from falling upon her. Letters were forged, tracks misleading, and the narrative of her departure subtly crafted to appear as if the mistress had vanished mysteriously. In this careful manipulation of perception, Livia's brilliance was fully realized. The world would never truly know the exact moment when the scales of power had shifted. Psychologically, the Davenport estate would never be the same. The overseers, who had once enforced authority with the mistress's backing, were left to confront a reality they could neither explain nor control. The delicate balance of hierarchy, previously maintained through fear and brute strength, had been irrevocably disrupted. The lesson was clear. Intelligence, patience, and subtlety could eclipse arrogance and cruelty, rendering traditional instruments of control powerless. Fear, now cultivated through observation and anticipation, became the new currency of power in the household. Beyond the immediate estate, the story of Livia's patience and meticulous vengeance began to take shape as a whispered legend. Other enslaved individuals in neighboring plantations spoke cautiously of the quiet house slave who had waited 20 years for her moment. Her tale, though shrouded in discretion, became a testament to the power of deliberate intelligence and long-term strategy. The notion that one individual, seemingly powerless and overlooked, could recalibrate the dynamics of power through observation, subtle manipulation, and unwavering patience resonated as both warning and inspiration. For Livia, the aftermath was marked by careful recalibration. She adopted a new identity, moving through distant plantations and towns, maintaining her invisibility while subtly influencing events when necessary. Her knowledge, patience, and intelligence remained her greatest assets. She trained younger enslaved women in observation, patience, and subtle influence, ensuring that the lessons of her experience would ripple quietly across the lives of those who followed. The act of vengeance, though now completed, became a framework for survival, empowerment, and silent rebellion that extended beyond the immediate moment of justice. Decades later, the Davenport estate's story persisted in hushed tones among both the enslaved and free communities. It became a narrative of patient justice, demonstrating the profound consequences of cruelty and the enduring power of intelligence exercised over time. The details of the act, the tools employed, and the network of complicity remained hidden. Yet the psychological impact endured. Fear and respect, subtle but pervasive, became as powerful as any physical instrument of control, ensuring that Livia's actions would shape the behavior of those who remained for generations. Livia herself faded into the shadows, her presence undetectable but her influence pervasive. She lived free, if quietly, knowing that her patience, strategic observation, and intelligence had created a moment of justice that would never be forgotten. She had shown that time, careful planning, and an understanding of human behavior could overturn even decades of oppression. In the quiet corners of her mind, she catalogued the lessons of each year, each observation, and each subtle act, ensuring that the principles of patience, intelligence, and calculated action would survive beyond her own life. By the end of her days, Livia's name had become a whispered legend. The quiet house slave who waited 20 years to bury her mistress alive. Not a tale of rash vengeance, but of deliberate, intelligent, patient justice, a testament to the power of knowledge, observation, and the enduring force of long-cultivated patience. Her legacy remained alive in the minds of those who had witnessed it, in the behavior of the enslaved who had been part of her silent network, and in the hushed tones of those who spoke of the Davenport estate for decades afterward. Livia had proven that patience, intelligence, and deliberate action could transform the powerless into the most formidable of strategists, and that justice, when carefully calculated, could endure beyond time, fear, and oppression.